Hello, and welcome to another edition of Conversations with Chartwell. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew Campbell. Matthew is the Asia editor of Bloomberg Businessweek and the co-author of Financial Times nominated Business Book of the Year, Dead in the Water. Dead in the Water tells the extraordinary tale of the supposed hijacking of an oil tanker off the coast of Yemen. Matthew, it's great to have you here. So for those of our audience that perhaps aren't familiar with the story, could you give us a brief background to the tale?
So in sum, Dead in the Water is the story of one of the most audacious financial frauds in history. And it centers on the apparent pirate attack and hijacking of an oil tanker called the Brillante Virtuoso in 2011. And the apparent part will become important for reasons we'll get into. And this event, this central incident, set off really an 8 or 9 year saga of corruption, malfeasance, murder, violence of various kinds, culminating in a very high stakes legal battle in the High Court in London.
And I want to start, the first bit I want to delve into is right at the start of the book. You kind of talk about the importance of global shipping, that everything we rely on a day-to-day basis depends upon it. And yet, we give very little thought to it, and particularly kind of in a ESG sense, when we often see companies worry a lot about what happens at the point of origin. There's a lot of work done on sweatshops, etc. But these, these global shipping, it's quite opaque. Often it's not really clear who owns the ships, and they sail under the flags of kind of Panama or Liberia, which means that worker regulation is minimal, and so we don't. The condition of these seafarers can be quite poor. And I wonder, in a quite secretive industry like this, what can companies do to give more thought to what actually happens to their goods in this intermediary period?
So there's a throwaway line about shipping, which is that it's 90% of everything, and that's actually not far off. A huge majority of the global trade in physical goods goes by sea. Air freight is a decently sized business, but in fact, compared to shipping, it's tiny. Most of the things that are around you in any room at any given time came to you on a boat. More likely than not, anyway. And one of the remarkable things about shipping is, despite being so important, it's pretty much invisible. Most of us certainly don't know any sailors. Unless you live in one of a few very specific places, you would very rarely see large ocean-going vessels. You just don't think about it. Shipping companies have largely disappeared to secrecy jurisdictions, offshore tax havens like the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, Bermuda. And a lot of this is by design. This is how the shipping industry wants to operate, which is in the shadows, largely free from regulation, and they have succeeded. It is, in fact, an almost completely unregulated industry, certainly by comparison with anything else that is as important. You alluded to what are called flags of convenience, and this is, many of us will have seen on the back of a vessel, it will say Liberia or Panama or the Marshall Islands. That is what's known as a flag of convenience, where you can pay, despite having no relationship to one of these countries, to register your vessel under the flag of, for example, Liberia or Panama. And then the laws of the so-called flag state are the laws that apply on board your vessel. This gets you into all kinds of funny territory. My favorite factoid about this is that the Liberian Registry is actually a private company based in Virginia. It has very little to do with actual Liberia, but it has paid for the right to use the Liberian flag. And if you are a corporation looking at your ESG profile, and looking at things like sourcing, which is very important to a lot of companies, whether you're in apparel, cars, technology, whatever it is. Shipping is kind of a black hole. There have been huge amounts of money expended on things like ensuring compliance at the factory level, making sure there's no forced labor in the factories in Bangladesh where the Gap gets its t-shirts or whatever the case may be. But there's very little of that energy directed toward the shipping business, toward all the points in between, everything that happens between the factory in Bangladesh and the store in San Francisco or wherever it is. And that's where shipping comes in, and shipping really has benefited from that lack of scrutiny. It has allowed a lot of environmental abuses. It has allowed terrible treatment of workers, who are largely very poorly paid men, almost always men, from a few countries, the Philippines, Indonesia, India in particular. And it has allowed fraud and financial crime to thrive in shipping, and that's what Dead in the Water really gets into.
And talking about that financial fraud, in this case, and I think reading the book, what's kind of surprising is that when this happens, that there's this evidence that mounts and mounts that something really nefarious has taken place. And the two kind of protagonists of your book, Veal and Connor, the two ex-coppers, they seem to have a real kind of indignation about what's happened, about this Greek ship owner has effectively scuttled his ship on purpose to write off his losses and make some money. But the actual underwriters who are on the hook for this, they often don't seem overly concerned, or if not concerned, they're reluctant to levy these charges at a ship owner and I suppose deter future business. And I wonder, when you apply that to kind of corporations more generally, how can you ensure that you have proper regulation, proper compliance, AML, when it may not necessarily be in your own financial interests or to go after crooks?
So in shipping, as in a lot of things in life, the scandal is what's legal. And one of the things that is legal, for example, is anonymous ownership. And this is something that blew my mind when I first learned it, that if you go out into, for example, the Singapore Strait, very close to where we're sitting right now, and look at the hundreds of ships that pass through on any given day, many of them will be owned by shell companies registered in offshore secrecy jurisdictions, and port authorities, banks, insurers, other ships who might have to deal with them in some way, have no idea who the ultimate owners are. And this in shipping is completely routine, completely legal, completely normal. If you mention this to someone, for example, in the airline world, where there are incredibly tight regulations, that's just completely shocking. But that is the way it is. And as you can imagine, anonymous ownership, being able to do things at sea and have no way for regulators or anyone else to trace them to you, the beneficial owner, sitting wherever you happen to be, allows all kinds of bad behavior. And one of the things that it does allow, and has allowed historically for a very long time, is insurance fraud. The intentional destruction of ships or cargoes in order to claim the insurance money. This is actually one of the oldest financial crimes in the world. It's at least as old as finance, basically, because even the ancient Greeks had maritime insurance of a kind. And another thing in reporting for Dead in the Water that I was absolutely astonished to learn was that maritime underwriters are often not terribly concerned about it. Fraudulent claims, or claims that certainly look dodgy, happen constantly. And many of them, perhaps most of them, get paid out, at least partially. And there are a few reasons for that. It's not a good look to accuse your biggest clients of fraud, because obviously those clients have choices and they can go to a different insurer if you prove too difficult. There's a very high legal bar in the English courts, which are where these insurance contracts are governed, for proving fraud. And so you're looking at potentially a very expensive and unpleasant legal battle. And the other reason is just, this is the way it's done. That for centuries now, the insurance industry has made plenty of money. This is a very good business. And if you pay out the occasional claim that perhaps in a very strict sense you shouldn't have, it's not a big deal compared to the scale of the profits being made. In terms of why businesses should be concerned about these compliance risks, or these ethical risks, if you like, even when there is not a legal issue or there is not a direct financial motive to be so concerned, I think there are a few reasons. One is you may get concerned eventually, and you never know when that's going to be. I think we've all seen lots of examples where a corporation thought something was okay, thought something was just the way things are done, and then eventually, whether because of media reporting by someone like me or a regulator who gets interested in a subject, something spills out onto the public stage and it turns out to be incredibly expensive. One example that comes to mind is LIBOR, where the way that LIBOR was being quote unquote set had been that way for years. It was just the way business was done. No one seemed to have a problem with it. Then eventually it went public, and this became a hugely expensive problem for essentially every large bank in London, and with criminal consequences for a number of the people involved. So eventually it will. I also think we are living in an era where governments are always looking for the next battle. It certainly is good politics to go after companies big and small. We've seen in the United States with Silicon Valley now being a really favored target of, in fact, both political parties. And it's quite unusual to have an industry that's equally hated by both sides of the aisle in the US. And so anything that a corporation is doing that is providing ammunition for those critics, that is providing an easy way to get in the headlines when some investigative journalist poking their nose into things eventually figures out what's going on, could be a very, very bad, risky, expensive decision if you have been ignoring wrongdoing all that time.
Absolutely. And moving on now to a bit of the narrative of the book and how this all came about, without ruining anything for people who haven't read it yet. I mean, it all starts with these supposed pirates climbing on board this oil tanker and supposedly hijacking it. And it seems 2011, when this all happens, it seemed that piracy was something we heard a lot more about, particularly Somalian piracy. And whether it's because there are bigger news stories now or whatever it is, we don't seem to see it in the news as much. So I wondered, kind of in the research you've done on this book, and within the context of the importance of global shipping, is this still something that's of a concern to people?
So piracy has existed, just like insurance fraud has existed for as long as shipping and finance have, so has piracy. Piracy goes back thousands of years. And what maritime piracy needs, somewhat paradoxically, is land. Pirates need a land base from which to operate, an ungoverned space. In the sort of Pirates of the Caribbean era, that was islands in the Caribbean Sea that pirates sort of dominated and were able to operate from unmolested, or were indeed allowed to do so by, for example, the British government, which had its own reasons to encourage privateers, as they were called. The reason that in 2011, when Dead in the Water starts, there was so much piracy was that Somalia was ungoverned. Somalia had essentially collapsed politically in 1992 and was, it's frequently described as a failed state since then. And that's not completely true. There were areas in Somalia that were more governed than others and that were more stable than others. But there were large parts of the Somali coast that were essentially lawless. And this meant pirates had a land base from which to operate. And quite luckily for them, Somalia abuts one of the most important shipping lanes in the world, which is the body of water heading into the Suez Canal, basically. So anyone going from Europe to Asia has to pass the Horn of Africa. In this period, there were pirate attacks every second or third day. Not all were successful, but many were. And when they were successful, what success means is a ship is captured and taken with its crew to somewhere on the Somali coast and held for ransom, possibly for years, until a ship owner, or more likely its insurers, pay out and pay the pirates. It was a good business. There were major investors backing these piracy operations, and it was a very stubborn problem. There were efforts by various navies, led by the US Navy, but also with 20 or 30 other countries involved, to police the seas, and particularly the Gulf of Aden, this body of water off the Horn of Africa. But it's a physics problem, basically. This is a very large stretch of ocean. Somali pirates were very skilled seafarers. They were able to operate, in some cases, hundreds of miles from shore. And getting to the scene of an attack in time was incredibly difficult. What brought the problem under control was a very deceptively simple sounding solution, which was armed guards on vessels, having ship owners pay for having a couple of often quite grizzled ex-soldiers to accompany a ship during the most dangerous part of its journey. And I often get asked, well, why didn't they just do that before? And there are a few reasons for that. One is legality. It was not clear whose law would apply. What happened if you turn up in port with a bunch of armed dudes with ballistic vests, and the government of wherever you might be has a problem with that. Another is liability. What if there's an accident on the ship? What if there's an accidental shooting? Similarly, is it legal as a ship owner to start potentially killing pirates? These were questions that everyone had to really grapple with. And the other consideration that did slow this down, of course, was cost. Shipping is all about cutting the cost of moving goods as far as possible. That's why Walmart exists. That is why it is economical to manufacture things in China and ship them around the world to their ultimate consumers, because shipping is very inexpensive. Anything you do on a vessel that adds cost is something you need to think about very carefully. So it did take a good long while, longer than you would think, for armed guards to be arrived at as the solution. And as a result, piracy in the Gulf of Aden has come down drastically. But there is still piracy happening all around the world, and there are various maritime reporting services that can tell you about this. The Gulf of Guinea is a big hotspot right now, where in West Africa, where there are enough ungoverned or minimally governed bits of Nigeria that passing ships can be threatened. So piracy has calmed down somewhat, but it's never going to go away, and it remains a problem even now.
And what about that network behind piracy, which you touch upon in the book? I think I kind of naively would have thought before this really was kind of a ragtag bunch of criminals, hopping on a ship, taking what they could and getting off. But I think, as you touched upon in the book, actually there's kind of real money to be made from this. and you need money people behind it. You know, you need sophisticated finance types to do something with the looting. Is that network, I mean, could you first of all say a little bit about that network and also whether that still exists as a kind of black market?
Characters you would see in, say, Captain Phillips, a very good film with Tom Hanks about a real-life pirate incident that actually sticks very closely to what actually happened, are these very unlucky guys in mesh tank tops with rusty Kalashnikovs, you know, who seem, as you say, like a very ragtag bunch. And that's accurate as far as it goes. That is the sharp end of Somali piracy, or was the sharp end of Somali piracy. But they were really part of a sophisticated financial operation. There were investors providing the capital for these piracy operations, many of them Somali businessmen or business people elsewhere in that region, and who, with the proceeds from these operations, would launder money into the global financial system. So actually a lot of investigations of piracy over the years, including some undertaken by Richard Veal, one of the main characters in the book, looked at the money side, particularly at what happens after the money comes out of Somalia, the ransom funds, get laundered into the global financial system and then invested in real estate or restaurants or businesses of various kinds all over the world. It probably won't shock anyone to hear that the hub for this kind of thing was Dubai. And one thing that the shipping industry wanted to really get moving on was cracking down on the financial institutions in the UAE and elsewhere that were handling this money. But as it happened, armed guards pretty much did the trick. And so these larger investigations into the network never really happened. So I would assume that whatever piracy is going on today, there is still an element of these sophisticated investors. But it was in Somalia that really this model kind of reached its apotheosis.
There are a lot of big characters in the book. And the Greek ship owner, for instance, Super Mario, I won't try and say his surname in case I...
Iliopoulos.
Okay, I was worried about massacring the Greek. You know, there's him, and there's kind of on the other side, I suppose, if there were goodies and baddies, there's David Mockett, this British surveyor in Yemen who goes to look at this ship and sees there's been something wrong. And yeah, I hope I'm not ruining it for too many readers by saying
It's on the book jacket.
Okay, good. He's killed. He's essentially assassinated in Yemen. So that's how he meets his end. And Super Mario, on the other hand, seems to meet quite a gentle end, that he effectively gets away with this whole thing. So I wondered, that this having been so much of your career, having worked on this story, what you thought about the kind of ethics of how these characters ended up.
I was really disappointed that no one involved with what we now know and what actually a judge in London in a civil case ruled was a gigantic fraud. No one was ever prosecuted. No one was ever seriously criminally investigated. There were some criminal investigations in the UK, but they essentially went nowhere. And I think there was a general washing of hands with this, aside from civil litigation, which did proceed and did happen and did result in a very strong judgment attributing responsibility for these events. I should say, not to the murder of David Mockett. No one has ever been charged with that, and certainly the ship owner, Marios Iliopoulos, has never been charged or investigated in connection with that murder. But there was a sort of abortive effort by a couple of police agencies in the UK to investigate these crimes, but it never really got off the ground. And I think the reasons for that are several. British law enforcement is under-resourced. That's a much bigger problem than this case. Certainly someone like Oliver Bullough, who wrote a book called Butler to the World, has written very persuasively about how outgunned white-collar crime enforcement can be in the UK. Another was jurisdictional complexity. Shipping is designed to straddle several jurisdictions at once. The ship owner, the ultimate beneficial owner, or UBO as they're called, is in one country. His or her companies are in another country. His or her ships are in another country. Between all of these, there are shell companies registered in various offshore tax havens all over the world. And the end result of this is that, from a law enforcement perspective, shipping and ships may as well be on Mars. They're not really anybody's problem. And so if you are looking for reasons not to pursue a crime, jurisdictional complications are very good ones. And unless you have, as you sometimes get in the US with very aggressive SDNY prosecutors who don't really care about that sort of thing, if you're in any country with a less aggressive law enforcement culture, as the UK does have, it's just not going to happen. And sadly, bad actors, criminals in the shipping industry, benefit from this fragmentation and benefit from the fact that a lot of police and law enforcement agencies just don't want such a difficult problem.
And away from the ethics of those particular characters, they are big characters, and they come across like that in the book. And reading it, it's clear that it's something people would enjoy seeing on screen as well. And with that in mind, have you made plans for this to be developed into a TV show or film?
There's nothing we can say publicly
just
yet, but I can say that Kit, my co-author, and I are very optimistic this is going to be on probably a small screen in the near future.
Great, well, I look forward to that. And finally, as part of Conversations with Chartwell, we're asking one final question, and it is, if you were to be stuck in a lift with anyone, who would you choose and why?
I would probably go with Robin Williams, which would be a very entertaining lift ride. And a lift ride is probably about as much time as you'd want to spend, because it would get pretty intense any longer than that.
I can imagine. Well, Matthew, thank you so much for coming in today. It's been great speaking to you.
Thanks so much.